All right. So one of the questions that that the church is dealing with now is the primacy of jurisdiction. Who's got power, and who gets to exercise it? And the papacy had become a very valuable office to hold, and so it had been being held by the Italians for many years, and the French cardinals and bishops were a little jealous and wanting to exercise some of that power and the wealth that came along with it. So there had been already a movement of monasteries under Clooney, where there was the monastery at Clooney had been a free association, self-determination, and kind of monastery where they were under control of under the Pope, but they were free of any local king or lord or medieval feudal structure controlling those monasteries. So this was one of those things where there's now a model in the church of self-determination, and that's beginning to happen with the merchant classes, with the universities, parliaments. Everybody is moving towards a sense of we're in charge of ourselves. We don't need the church to be in charge of us. So what happens is, the question that is going to be plaguing the church at this time is, can the church be restructured to reflect that evolution that's happening in Western medieval society? And one of the things that happens is the papacy gets controlled by the French, and so we have essentially these two popes, Celestine V and Boniface VIII, move and the papacy to France. So even though Celestine had wanted to reform the church around, some sort of a more simplistic and more simple philosophy and spirituality like that of St. Francis, he wasn't able to do that. And after 5 months as a pope, he resigned. And he was also, and he went off to a monastery and became a hermit, and founded the Celestines, which was a branch of the Benedictine order. Then there were all these other very spiritual Franciscans who were very extreme proponents of a conservative rule of St. Francis. St. Francis had, as I may have mentioned to you, had to give up control of his order because there were those who wanted to have a more relaxed kind of rule where the Franciscans were able to hold property and that kind of thing. And Francis was very against that. But these spiritual Franciscans regarded the wealth of the church as really scandalous, and they wanted to have a more spiritual model of the papacy. There was also a movement within Italy as well to reform the papacy, but that didn't succeed. Then under Boniface, who holds the office for quite a while, he holds it for about 9 years, and Boniface clashed with the initiatives of other French kings like Philip, and Philip wanted to seize church property and levied taxes on the French clergy to finance a war with England, and the Pope declared him excommunicated, and he imposed a penalty as well on anybody who paid the tax without permission to the Pope. That's what Philip did. And Philip responded back by forbidding the export of any gold or silver, crippling the economy of Rome. So Boniface was then forced to compromise and allow the French clergy to make voluntary contributions to Philip. And later a papal legate, a representative of the Pope, was sent in 1301 to complain, and the king had the legate representative arrested and charged with high treason. Boniface then ordered his release and summoned Philip to Rome. Philip called an assembly of French nobles, clergy, and commoners who supported him in his defense of the papacy. And Boniface responded with his famous papal bull in 1302, Unum Sanctum. And then Philip responded by declaring that Boniface was incompetent to occupy the papal throne, and he summoned the Pope to appear before a council of the Western Church. Boniface, however, would have excommunicated Philip, only Philip had the people kidnapped and imprisoned and demanded his resignation. So back and forth, Boniface and Philip are going. And Boniface eventually says that he's not going to resign the papacy. He would rather sooner die than do that. And he was then Philip's representative then slapped him and beat him badly, humiliated him, and he was nearly executed, but he managed to get released. And after 3 days, he died in 1303. So this back and forth is crippling the papacy in terms of the public opinion about it, which is going to be very, very important in terms of the eventual reformation of the church. So after the episode, the next Pope, Benedict XI, restored the fortunes of a lot of Boniface's enemies, but refused to try the former Pope, and he died after a brief pontificate. Then there's a pro-French party obtained an agreement from the cardinals on the election of Clement V. Clement never had visited Rome even once, and he moved the papal curia to Avignon, France in 1309. So Clement agreed to try Boniface, even though Boniface had been exonerated. Clement forgave the Nogaret who had slapped Boniface, and his companions commended Philip of France. So now the fortunes are turning in favor of the French. And under Clement, the Templar order was also tried and condemned. So right now, the papacy is becoming a tool of the French. And so now the papacy is no longer in Rome. Now it's been moved to France, and it's in France for almost for many years, for almost 70 years. But the first Pope in Avignon was Clement V. And this is often called the time when the papacy is in France, called the Babylonian captivity, which is the term that they used when the Jews were exiled and they lost their temple in 586. So the Romans called it the Babylonian captivity of the church because they were held captive in France. So now the papacy is a puppet of the French monarchy, and heavy papal taxes now begin. And we'll move on. Yeah. So then there's a series of popes that get elected in Avignon. John the 13th. He ruled for. He was elected at 72 and ruled for 18 years, which they were hoping. Every time they hope that a pope gets elected for a short period of time, because they want to transition, they end up living long lives. So, but the ones who get elected for a length of time end up dead shortly thereafter. And then Benedict XII was elected, and he built a great papal palace in Avignon. And that alienated the English and the Germans during that 100-year war. And then Clement gets elected, the sixth, and he tried to mediate that 100-year war between the English and the Germans. But because of the Black Plague, a lot of people saw that as a punishment for the papacy's absence from Rome. And then afterwards, after 10 years with Clement, we get Innocent, who attempts to return to Rome, but he dies before he tries and is able to accomplish it. Then we get Urban V, who was called the Reforming Pope. He wanted to return to Rome in 1365, but the Romans received him with joy, but in the long run, he failed to win their loyalty, so they returned back to Avignon. Then we get Gregory, who was made a cardinal by his uncle, Clement, when he was 17. So he's one of the youngest popes we probably ever had in history. And then Catherine of Siena comes on the scene, and she is, a founder of a religious order, considered one of the a doctor of the church, and a very bright woman, but also very deeply spiritual. And she sees the having the papacy in France is a bad thing, and she's able to convince the Pope to bring the papacy back to Rome. So she convinces Gregory the 11th, who returns to Rome, and the city is kind of distracted as well, but they wanted an Italian next after he dies. So she is, like I said, famous for her mystical writings and for her visions as well. And she said it was her mission to bring the papacy back to Rome. She died, however, 3 years later after.
Was she Italian? Where is Siena?
In Italy.
Yeah, she's Italian. Okay, she did.
So the whole 70-year experience of having the papacy over there really suffered the reputation of the papacy. Europe saw the papacy as basically a tool of monarchs, and the way the French had done this by raising all these taxes created even a greater sense of distrust in the papacy. People begin to wonder, what's the point of having a papacy when you've got lots of bishops who aren't even who are purchasing their offices, who aren't present in their dioceses, and they're selling it back and forth to people who can pay the highest price for it. And so, what happens next is called the Great Western Schism. In the Western Church, we've got the schism between the East and the West, but this is going to be a schism where we're going to have at one point up to 3 different popes, all elected at the same time, or holding the office. So Gregory he had actually considered returning to Rome, back to France, but he, conditions, didn't really look ideal, and he died before he had the chance to bring it back to Avignon. Now the people of Rome are fearing that they're going to elect another French cardinal, and who would return it to Avignon. So the crowds in Italy and Rome are really riled up. So a mob invaded the papal palace, where the conclave of cardinals was meeting, and demanded that they elect a Roman, or at least an Italian. So under duress, the cardinals elected the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. Bartolomeo Prignano was his name. And so both the French and the Italians participated in all that. He was elected. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance to the whole thing. And Pope Urban VI, 1378 to 1389.
Frank,
Yeah.
What was it about Rome? What was it about the conditions in Rome that were not ideal? Were the accommodations bad? I mean, it was like...
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I was taking a glass of water. It was the probably the inability to move easily back to France. There was the mobs, and the people were preventing the French cardinals from leaving and exercising the influence again. So they probably brought soldiers and others and mercenaries and others to prevent the French court from moving back to France. That's more likely what happened. So we don't know exactly what, just all that's that historians just say the conditions were not ideal. So I don't know what exactly they mean by that. Now, what I'm going to tell you is information that the history books will always whitewash. This is going to be secret information that is from the Vatican secret archives. It's not in your history books. The church has completely hidden this fact of history, but fortunately, my professor of church history back in the days when I was at Loyola had access to this Vatican secret archives, and he revealed to us in class what the archives contained about Pope Urban VI. But first, let me tell you what Urban tried to do. In some cases, what he tried to do were some good things. He tried to curb absenteeism. He declared that bishops needed to be in their who were in his court, needed to be in their dioceses, and they needed to be pastors to those people. And if not, they were going to be traitors to Christ. He denounced the ostentatiousness of the cardinals and declared that any gifts they received were guilty of simony. He tried to curb the French influence. He appointed a vast number of Italian cardinals, and many of those were relatives. So he was guilty of nepotism. Many of the cardinals charged that Urban had gone mad and began to form an opposition party against him. Now, here's the information that the church has kept secret. He was crazy.
He really was.
Literally was crazy. Dead bodies were being found in the Vatican Palace. He was coming up on people and killing them. He was like a modern,
Jack the Ripper, yeah.
Jack the Ripper, he had literally really gone mad. He was killing cardinals left and right. And now popes doing this kind of stuff necessarily wasn't always, there's no lack of precedent for popes doing this kind of thing, poisoning other people and killing people, and that kind of thing. But he had gone literally, had a split personality, and was literally crazy.
So he was murdering people with his bare hands. He wasn't ordering that someone be
he was doing it
put out of the way,
Yeah.
with poison or whatever,
knifing them
arrested
in
or
the
something.
back, knifing them in the back, and just dead bodies were appearing everywhere. So, the cardinals meet secretly and figure out what are we going to do? How are we going to? We were supposedly guided by the Holy Spirit in this election. How are we going to say that we elected a crazy man? So the cardinals consult with canon lawyers, and the lawyers say, let's say that the crowds forced your hand and you were not able to operate freely without fear for your lives. And so a plot begins to emerge with French and Italian cardinals who joined in opposition to Urban, and they fled Rome and they gathered in Anagni. And I mean, they flee. I mean, again, the history books will tell you that Urban had a difficult personality, that he was making people angry, that he wasn't very tactful, blah, blah, blah. It's complete nonsense. But the church didn't want to, come out publicly with the fact that he had gone crazy. So that, they just say that, well, the cardinals, started saying that he was mad, but it was literally, he was a killer. So they went to Agni there and they elected a new pope. They said the election of Urban was not valid. And so they elected a new pope. The Italians that were present abstained, but they didn't protest because they knew what the real truth was. And this pope was elected, and he took the name of Clement VII. Now we had an unprecedented situation. For the first time, there were two popes elected by the very same cardinals. And the new pope took up arms against Urban and attacked Rome, but he was repulsed and he resided back. He went and resided in Avignon instead. Now all of Western Europe had to take sides. Who do you want to go with? You go with the Roman or the Avignon papacy. So it divides this way: France, Scotland, and parts of Spain go to Clement, and some German nobles as well, and another group from England, Scandinavia, Flanders, Hungary, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire go with the Roman papacy. So now Europe is divided.
Roman papacy being the mad papacy?
Huh?
The Roman papacy being mad Clement?
Yes, right. Urban VI and Clement VII.
And these were probably the bishops that kind of didn't know, because it was the Italian and the French that were working together to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, they were the there were minor bishops, here and there, but
Yeah.
But
they didn't know the whole story.
Yeah. So, each city in Italy basically followed their own course, they changed alliances as it was politically expedient for them. As you see, the Kingdom of Naples sided with the Avignon papacy. So now we've got, quite a mess on our hands. This is what the history books will tell you, that Urban didn't make things easy. Urban, created a principality for his nephew, became embroiled in a series of senseless wars. When some of the cardinals suggested changing his policy, he had him arrested, and they died of suspicious means. That's the most you're going to get in the history books. And then Urban dies in 1389, and the cardinals elected Boniface IX. And by taking the name Boniface, they were hoping that he would follow in sort of the anti-French policies of the earlier Boniface. So we have these two lines of popes, two competing ones. And it even highlighted the other clerical abuses and ecclesiastical abuses, especially that of people purchasing the office and competing popes in need of funds. Then eventually a group gathers together in Pisa, hoping to settle the controversy. And they elect another pope, Alexander V, in 1409. So you can see there on the chart, the Avignon papacy at the top, and then the return under Gregory back to Rome. Urban gets elected, you see there on the left. And then there's a series of 3 popes at one point. So we get Innocent the 7th, Alexander the 5th, and then Benedict the 13th. I did some genealogical research. You'll appreciate this, Cindy. And I think the Spanish were trying to elect a new pope at one point, and I could be descended from that pope that the Spaniards attempted to elect, but I don't know. I haven't done detailed enough genealogical research to figure that one out. But the Spaniards decided to get in on the action, and but he doesn't get mentioned in many history books. I've just found him in some genealogical sources here and there. So you can see we got 3 popes at one point: Avignon, Rome, and Pisa. Now, how do we settle this? How do we heal this fracture? And that's going to be the question that really is going to dominate a lot of conversation in the universities in Europe. But at the same time, you can see having 3 popes like this, it creates a real scandal. Now, eventually, once this is settled, the history books and the Catholic Church will only recognize the popes that were elected in Rome, not any others, not the ones in Pisa and not the ones in Avignon. The Church considers them anti-popes. And Martin V is the one who sort of emerges from this whole fray. So at the University of Paris, the scholars there decided they proposed 3 solutions. One, both popes resign, and a new conclave gets created to proceed with electing of a new one. But none of the cardinals that were in Avignon or Pisa or Rome wanted to do this because it would question their. Every side would accuse the other side of taking power and admitting that they're right or they're wrong. And so they basically never ended up really proceeding in that direction. So they could settle it by negotiation, arbitration, where both parties agree to some third solution, or the third option, which is an ecumenical council, which was called to decide the matter. And that's the one they went with, calling a council. So they called the council. Charles the Sixth of France intervenes with the Avignon cardinals not to elect a new pope, that he could convince the pope in Rome to abdicate. But the Avignon cardinals felt that they had a good case and they could be weakened, if the Romans elected or the Romans abdicated. And so they ended up electing Benedict the 13th anyways. Charles responded by besieging Avignon, and they had to abandon the siege due to changing political fortunes. Meanwhile, the Roman popes begin a series of maneuvers to make it appear that they wanted to end the schism. Both sides refused to negotiate, which ended up alienating many of the cardinals on both sides. And the Roman cardinals were the first to break with their pope and began negotiating with the Avignon papacy. Meanwhile, France withdraws its support for Benedict, and the stage is set for the Conciliar Movement. And this is going to be the way that the church is able to handle this. Basically, the Conciliar Movement is where the power of the papacy is reduced and you elect a council. The council of the church is what is more powerful now. And the Council of Constance says, okay, everybody resigns, we elect Martin V, and that brings an end. The shift from a strong papacy to a strong church council is what ends up happening. The council orders that the Pope has to call a council every 10 years. And for a while, it looks like this is the way the church is going to be governed, is not by a strong Pope, but by a church council. Kind of like the way the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church function. We function by conventions, and no one presiding bishop has power over the church convention. It's both are ruling together, and it's might be a good democratic way to go, but eventually that fails. So this new pope, it gets called at Constance, and in 1415. Okay.
Dennis, is that your dog?
That's my dogs. There's somebody out on the has the nerve to walk across the sidewalk in front of my house, so they've got to defend the territory.
Any questions here so far?
Yeah, I was wondering, is there any connection between urban as the name of a pope and the way we use the word urban today, urban rural? It just seems kind of weird.
You know, I don't know. I don't know if the origins of the word urban comes from that. I don't know. Interesting for a wordsmith to figure that out. You can probably Google that.
I'm doing right now.
Google anything and find an answer to something. So my professor of church history, Father Herb Ryan, acted out. He was an actor, and he acted out the whole scene of Urban killing popes. We were outside, and it was a beautiful outside day in Los Angeles, and we were all sitting on the grass, and he's out there, you know, dramatically, you know, doing this whole, much better than I could possibly do. But the fact that we got to hear that he, you know, he was one of these church historians that had access to the Vatican archives, which, you know, you have to be a certain type of scholar to be able to have access and plead that you won't disclose information. But he disclosed it anyways to us, and I've been really proud to know that information about Pope Urban, the crazy Pope.
I Googled Urban.
Yeah.
It's from Latin for urbanus, which means city. Urb means city. Mm-hmm. So maybe he took the name Urban because he was. Well,
there have been 5 previous Urbans.
Right. And yeah. So, but urban means city. So maybe that was the name taken because it means, you know, kind of encompassing all.
The city of God or something.
Yeah, or just the fact that it's people, you know, it's this. It's a city, so it's this. Mm.
Going to bring up the next week's slides and move us forward.
Oh. Can you send those? You're bringing them up?
Sure.
So where the fictional or non-fictional Pope Joan, where does she fit in this barrage? Or does she? Is this later?
I think it's later, but I don't think she fits into this scene. Oops.
How did they finally get the final council that finally picked one pope? I mean, what people were they, and who said you can be on that council?
It was made up of bishops, cardinals, priests, scholars. That's who was at the council. Lasted for years, and the council didn't just elect a new pope. They also condemned John Huss, the Czech reformer. Basically, what the council wanted to do was affirm their authority, their power. And that was what was really super important to them. They didn't really deal with a lot of church heresies and things like that. It was more having to do with, what's our we need to reassert the church's power and organizational power and authority. And it was not so much a setting of doctrinal issues.
Pope Joan was way, way before.
Was she?
Yeah, 855 to 857, somewhere around there. But she's still just
It's a legend.
a legend, and she was written about way later, so it's
Yeah.
not necessarily.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious. I always follow English history. What was going along. England wasn't really involved in this that much.
No.
And because during English history, during that time, they had their own issues.
Right.
And so they weren't
War of the
really.
Roses.
Just before, yeah. Well, it was the beginnings of.
Yeah.
But most of it had to do with favorites having too much power and weak kings, and that they went through a period of very weak kings, Edward II, the Third, and their favorites had way too much power, and Piers, can't think of his name. Anyway, and then the War of the Roses was starting. Basically, it's the beginning of the War of the Roses.
Yeah.
So they were kind of embroiled in their own thing. And it wasn't until the Tudors came along that the English kings sort of went, Rome, you're just too much power.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that next week. Henry VIII and all that. We covered that last night with my students.
Good old Henry. He was a good king until he got his accident.
2 Catherines, 2 Annes, 1 Jane.
I mean, and his whole thing was having an heir was very important because his father had basically usurped the throne. So they didn't have a good, strong tie to the throne.
Yeah, that's a mess back and forth with. I'm going to send you both week 6 and 7 since I'm here now. Might as well just send it both this week and next week's.
Okay.
My computer is operating very slowly.
During a lot of this period, England was just part of France. The Plantagenets were based in Avignon, in France, and didn't speak English and didn't often go there. It was like it gradually the English got to be more independent as time went on. But it was really the War of the Roses that had where there was actually a real distinct English monarchs. Yeah.
Right, but when they got to this point, the Plantagenets were mostly, because the 100 Years' War, they started losing a lot of French territory.
Yeah.
And they were towards the ends of the Plantagenets, they were more English.
Right. They lost. They were driven back to England, basically.
Yeah, John had lost a lot of territory. John basically made them an English throne. But if it wasn't for John, we wouldn't have had the Magna Carta.
True.
Which has anybody ever seen the Magna Carta? It's about this big.
It's yes.
Tiny, tiny, tiny writing. They have to use a magnifier to see it. And I was amazed how, this is this is the beginning of democracy, basically. And it's so tiny.
And Krula. Okay. All right. Week 6. All right, I'm sending that to you now.
You know, this whole sweep of the, you know, the medieval church, you know, kind of makes a mockery of the apostolic succession. I don't see a spiritual drift in any of this. It was all who's in charge and, you know,
Right.
who gets the money and you know, squabbling about, you know, privilege and, you know, what were, you know, I guess there were still priests around who spoke the gospel and talked directly to people, and it wasn't just total, you know, cultural superstition, you know, that people had to do. But you know, there must have been a real church going on somewhere at
Right.
some level, but it wasn't at the level of the popes and the bishops and cardinals.
Right. There were still some good bishops, some good priests, and but yeah, this is why Luther and the Anglican Church both maintained that it wasn't the whole pipeline theory of apostolic succession, where, you know, who laid hands on who and who, you know, that whole kind of pipeline was not as important as maintenance of the apostolic teaching. That as long as the apostolic teaching gets passed along correctly, then the church is fulfilling the apostolic succession and maintaining apostolic tradition. Whereas some reformers, some churches said, let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's get everything, you know, do everything back to the way the early church was. You know, go back to the Bible only, and anything that's tradition, anything that's not in the Bible gets thrown out. And the Anglican approach was, well, if it's not in the Bible, but it's useful for worship, or the Bible doesn't prohibit it, then you can do it. You're permitted to do it, as long as the Bible doesn't prohibit and there's nothing mentioned. So, for example, organs. Calvin, was it Calvin? Either Calvin or Zwingli wanted to get rid of organs because organs were not in the Bible. And Luther said, no, wait a minute. We can maintain organs and beautiful music because it helps the worshiper, you know, it helps create a beautiful a sense of worship. So that's why we've been able to maintain a more liturgical life, because we've maintained tradition and apostolic teachings, you know, of the past.
So instead of having church service with lutes and panpipes.
Right. The instruments that are in the Bible, or then there's the denominations that the Church of God denomination that has no music.
Yeah.
No singing, no music at all. And then
Which is really weird because the Jewish faith, music is very important.
Yeah.
I've never understood the, you know, in modern times, the anti-wine thing, because wine is in the Bible.
Right.
So
Right.
the whole grape juice thing, I never quite got that one.
Had something to do with prohibition, I'm sure.
Yeah, the temperance movement and all that stuff.
Yeah.
All righty. We're ready to go here. So the Conciliarism movement is what resolves this great schism. And so as we mentioned, there was these two popes, rival popes, and the Conciliar movement, basically, the word conciliar comes from the word council, sought to basically settle the issue. And they do with Martin V. As I mentioned, the council in Pisa was unsuccessful. They elected Alexander. Then there were three, right? Those were the anti-popes at Pisa. Sigismund, Emperor Sigismund from Germany, tries to intervene. And eventually, the council gets called in 1414, and the council settles the matter. The existing pope thought that the council would go with him, but demanded instead his resignation, and he refused to do that for months, and he was a fugitive. In the end, his supporters failed him, and he was arrested he was returned to Constance and he was forced to resign. And not too long after John's resignation, Pope the 12th was resigned as his per his promise that the other popes would do likewise, and the council, as I said, elected Martin V. Then there were 3 additional councils after that, or there was the three councils were the one in Constance, and it later the one that Martin called, because remember he had promised that he would call one every 10 years. He called it, but it was before he was able to get there, he died, and his successor Eugene IV refused to adjourn, and he ended up electing an anti-pope. That's what they ended up doing, Felix V, and he gave up claim in 1449. Then the council in Florence, in Ferrara, Florence, Eugene decreed that the council be moved to Basel, from Basel to Ferrara, and eventually there the council attempted a formula of reunion between the East and the West, so that the East could get aid from the West, because Constantinople was under attack by the Turks. But after that failed, the council was able to, come up with a couple of other theological ideas. One of them being the idea of purgatory, and the idea that that in the East agreed to that, and then they also agreed to the supremacy of the Pope if they could get aid in fighting off the Turks. But when that aid didn't come, the reunion plans failed. And eventually, Felix V gave up his claims to the papacy. So once this is all resolved, we now move into, in a sense, this period called the Renaissance, which all of us has probably have studied in history. And the word Renaissance, of course, means rebirth of knowledge. And it was really a kind of a cultural movement in universities and nobility between the 14th and the 17th centuries. There was a flowering of, as you see there, art, science, literature, religion, and politics. It would be really a mistake to say that the Renaissance was a cause of the Reformation. That had really, the Reformation, as we'll see next week, really had very little to do with the Renaissance movement. Really, the Renaissance movement was a critique of medieval thinking. And there was, from the Christian perspective, the Renaissance was really a lot about moving back to some spiritual concerns, to the present life, rather than simply pie in the sky when you die. It's really more about, about affirming this life, the beauty of this life, the earth, the dignity of the earth, the beauty of the earth. And so now art begins to take a different approach, much more elevation of the body and the beauty of the body, as we can see that in, Michelangelo's David and other beautiful statues and that you see throughout Europe and Rome. Whereas in the Middle Ages, the art had been very flat. The Renaissance period really was a transformation of appreciating beauty and appreciating classical philosophy, like bringing back of readings of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. So it was an appreciation for all that learning that had happened in the past. So people who were in the Renaissance considered, the past really kind of like dark ages. But as we know that the Middle Ages, the medieval period was not dark. There was a lot of intellectual curiosity, scholasticism. There was a lot of flowering of and development of intellectual culture during the Middle Ages. And so it would be wrong to call it the Dark Ages, because there was a lot of good stuff happening in the medieval period, minus the medieval papacy. So it was, it was a gazing backward in time back to the early Greek and Roman days, not so much the immediate period of time, but they considered the classical period to be a golden age. And when intellectual philosophers were wrestling with other types of problems that were not medieval problems. So the Renaissance thinkers thought that the medieval time had been too formal, too compartmentalized, too logical, too systematic, too Aristotelian. So the Renaissance people wanted to open up culture to the the Greek and Roman times.
Wasn't that also because the Byzantine Empire had fallen and a lot of the scholars that were there
Yeah,
came to
They-
Italy,
that's right.
and they had the Byzantine church and everything had still all the Roman and all the Greek stuff they had always had. And so now the Italians were, or Europe was being reintroduced to a lot of the stuff that was kind of lost.
Right. Well, but the monasteries had also maintained and
Yes.
kept much of that stuff,
Mhm.
Yeah.
and it had come in as well during from the Moors, and when the Moors controlled Spain.
There was more access to the
Yeah.
common man as opposed to people that were in monasteries.
Right. These two individuals, John Wycliffe and John Huss, are considered sort of forerunners of the Reformation period. John Wycliffe and John Huss. So we'll take a look at Wycliffe for a minute. So he is sometimes people call him the Morning Star of the Reformation. He was a famous lecturer at Oxford in philosophy and theology. He was also a religious advisor to the court of Edward III, and appears because of his religious views were very useful weapons for England in their battle with the papacy. So he was able to create this idea of here are some of his thoughts. Here we go. Position on legitimate dominion. He said that all authority really comes from God, and that authority has to be lived and exemplified by how Christ lived. In other words, to serve, a servant leadership, servant ministry. So a good king has to be a ruler who serves, and not one who exercises, just power for the sake of exercising power. And ecclesiastical power also has to do it in a spiritual and good way, just the opposite of what we've just seen in the medieval papacy, that if the church is going to collect taxes, it has to do it not for its own benefit, but to help others and help the poor. And so if you don't exercise that power like Christ and like God, then you forfeit your right to have that power. And so you can see where England is already saying, you know what, this is a great idea because it helps us with our battles against the papacy. So you begin to start seeing already here the seeds of thought that allow for Henry to be able to eventually, cut us off from Rome and create its own state church, because the papacy had sunk in terms of it had sunk its reputation throughout Europe over the Avignon and the Great Western Schism. So essentially, he says, look, civil power and spiritual power, church and state, both have to act for the benefit of the people and not just for your own benefit. Regarding the church, he also believed that the church is not an outward organization to be controlled by the papacy and the priesthood, but it is the whole, all the elect. Everyone is the church. An idea that we have today, of course, a very modern idea, but back then the church, was controlled by the papacy, and he's saying, no, the people are the church. those who are destined to salvation by God's grace. And he said that the head of the church is not the Pope, but Christ. And the Pope could be the head only of the outward institutional visible church that existed in the city of Rome, made up of both the elect and the non-elect persons. Regarding the papacy, he argued that it was of human origin, not divine. He said that the Pope had no authority over secular governments, and only popes who walked humbly with Christ could say that they were really Peter's succession. Otherwise, they were anti-Christ. Of course, later on, he basically says all popes, regardless of their behavior, are really anti-Christ. Regarding scriptural authority, scripture is the final word. The Bible is the only source of Christian doctrine by which we have to live. Believers must test all their church teachings, and including the church fathers and the papacy and all ecumenicals, by the standard of the Bible. And he also believed all Christians should be able to read the Bible in their own native language. So he translated the Latin Bible into English, and it was the very first work of English translation of its kind. And he copied it, and he copied the entire thing by hand, which is quite the feat.
This is the beginnings of Protestantism.
Yeah, that's why they think of him as forerunners of Protestantism. Mm-hmm. Again, he's not trying to start a new church. He's trying to reform the church. He had a disciple, John Purvey, who created a better translation later on. But it was, as you're right, the beginnings of the laity being able to read the Bible. And it's at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 that we talked about this last week, transubstantiation. It is at that council in 1215 that declares this philosophy, part of the church's doctrine. And he denied it. He rejected the transubstantiation argument because the views, he argued the views of previous reformers like Radimus and Augustine. He said the bread and the wine remain bread and wine in substance and accident. He said the body and blood is just spiritually, it's truly present in a spiritual matter. So it's more of a commemoration idea. He also argued that the Eucharist was, however, preserved in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Again, because it's not, the Eastern Church is not trying to define how it happens, but that it does happen. He was, let's see, what else is there? Bread and wine, okay. Eventually, his views get condemned in Oxford. He was allowed to resume his studies and writings. He died in 1384, but of natural causes, so he was allowed to be buried in the church cemetery. But 34 years later, church authorities dug up his bones, burned them for heresy, and threw them into the Swift River. So isn't that great? These Christians back then, they love so much. They love each other so much, So the Council of Constance condemned him, and people who came after Wycliffe were called Lollards, and the Lollard Movement essentially was a Wycliffean movement, and it really grew in England. And so it was there even when Thomas Cranmer and all these other reformers are coming along the scene. So in other words, the Lollard movement set the stage, and Wycliffe set the stage in the ground for eventual Reformation in England. Now, the word Lollard simply means mumblers, possibly. They were, because the fact that they were mumbling and talking passages from the Bible. So people call them mumblers because everything that they were talking about was from Scripture, and they were always talking, reading Scripture and preaching Scripture. They also, the Lollards believed they were against clerical celibacy, pilgrimages, and abuses of images. They grew throughout those closing years. They denounced the papacy, and they also condemned transubstantiation, prayers for the dead, pilgrimages, and the holding of political offices by bishops and other things. Another reformer named John Huss is in what is, was known as Czechoslovakia, is in Prague, University of Prague. He's a rector there. Starts preaching in a nearby chapel of Bethlehem, and he came under the influence of Wycliffe. He was reading his writings, and through the marriage of English King Richard II to Anne of Bohemia, Bohemia being in that area where John Huss was, so he came into an understanding of Wycliffe's teachings. And aside from ending the papal schism, the Council of Constance, the other aim was to rid the church of any heresy and corruption. So they condemned Huss, and as a forerunner of Reformation, and he became the Council of Constance took aim at him as well. So John Huss was his views were questioned because of suspicions with Wycliffe, and the King of Bohemia supported the scholars, compelling the Czech scholars, compelling the Germans to leave Prague and founded a university in Leipzig. And the Germans declared that Prague had become a hotbed of heresies over there. So back and forth. The Council of Pisa, as we talked about, attempted to end the schism, and failed, and they ended up electing their own pope. And then Huss, felt that he couldn't obey and continued preaching at the Chapel of Bethlehem. And eventually Huss was summoned to Rome to answer for his disobedience, and he refused to go, and he was excommunicated in 1411. He was also burned at the stake, and I'll get to that here in a second. Yeah, here are some of his views. Again, his views are that Christ is the head of the church. Popes could make mistakes and error and create errors. Christians didn't have to obey immoral and unworthy clergy. Argued that the church was made up of the elect, those who had been predestined to be saved. He attacked indulgences. Suggests that he, argued that nobody could purchase forgiveness; it was freely given by God. Anybody who confessed their sins, God would forgive them. So obviously, no need for a priest to be involved. And he believed that the state ought to reform the church if the church was unwilling to be reformed. And he also believed that at communion, the bread and the wine should be served, not just the bread.
When did they stop? The Catholic Church always did just bread, and then when did they go to bread and wine for the parishioners?
The Catholic Church really went to bread and wine after Vatican II in this last modern era. It's been.
And what was the reasoning of not drinking the wine?
Concerned that it was that it could spill, that it could get contaminated by others, that it was something special for the priest.
Something that was too sacred, and they were worried of spilling it.
Too sacred. Also, the cost of providing wine for everybody was probably also another factor that was prohibitive to the church. But those were some of the reasons that were given. Eventually, as I said, he's excommunicated at that council. They made him suffer tremendous imprisonment in terrible conditions for months and months. Headaches, fever, bleeding, vomiting. he was ordered to recant his heresies, which he said that he would gladly do if somebody could show him where anything that he had done was wrong. Eventually he was condemned, and he was martyred, and he was taken out. They shaved his head, put a paper crown decorated with demons, and they gave him one last chance to recant, and he was burned at the stake. While they were doing that, he recited the Psalms. And that's a quote from him: "I appeal to Jesus Christ."
Did the Catholic Church eventually recant what they did to him?
He is considered in that city a saint by the Czechs, but the Moravian Church is really the ones who really kind of were the sort of the Moravians are sort of the we call the successors to the Bohemian movement, which we're going to get to now. I don't think the church ever came back and said, the Catholic Church ever came back and said, we made a mistake here. I don't think they've done that with Huss, but he's a leader of he's considered by the Protestant Church a saint by, in terms of the way we consider saints. We don't have the same process that the Catholic Church does to make somebody a saint, but the church does, the Anglican Church and the Lutheran Church, I'm sure, see him as a saintly figure, one who should be venerated and died as a martyr. His martyrdom really is what sort of creates a rebellion in Bohemia. Two groups that claimed that they were inspired by Huss came into existence, the Taborites and the Horebites, and they believed that the word of God ought to be preached freely, communion in both kinds, clergy should live in apostolic poverty, and that gross and public sin ought to be punished severely. So the Catholics tried to crush the rebellions in Bohemia several times, but the Hussites were very able military and were able to repel Catholic armies repeatedly. So they were not very good at quelling that rebellion. So they finally just decided to let them be. And as a result, the church in Bohemia rejoined Western Christendom through negotiations and allowed them to retain communion in both kinds. A lot of the nobility accepted the agreement. Some left the church and founded the Union of Brethren, and that grew rapidly, not only in Bohemia, but also in Moravia. And they established ties with Protestants in the 16th century, and then some allied eventually with Lutheranism. And they eventually, many of them came to America under the Habsburg persecution. The last guy is Savonarola, Girolamo Savonarola, and he was an Italian friar, Dominican, and he was invited to Florence to preach there by Lorenzo de' Medici, and he joined a monastery of St. Mark, and he began a series of lectures to the friars, and soon he developed popularity. He began to preach, and during 1491 in Lent, he was invited to preach in the main church, and he preached a sermon which really contrasted Christian life with the life of luxury of the Medicis. And eventually he lost favor with Lorenzo de' Medici, and he was a fiery preacher. He attacked the Pope, Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, and other preachers were hired to attack him. But basically he grew in popularity, and but he was in no sense in any way a Protestant. But he was able to get support and eventually he ran the city. So as the prior of St. Mark's, he had a desire to sell the convent's holdings and gave proceeds to the poor. He embarked on a reform of the city, monastic houses, and so he wanted to create a holy city. And for that, people thought of him as a very saintly, good man. And even Lorenzo de' Medici, when he was on his deathbed, called the friar to come to his deathbed and offer him last rites. Savonarola was expelled from Florence for trying to buy Charles off as he marched south to claim the crown of Naples. And he led the embassy to negotiate with Charles when Charles entered. And he made unreasonable requests, and he intervened, and as a result, Florence became allies with France. The prestige was so great that the people of Florence then turned to him to guide the city in establishing their government. Florence became a republic, and the economy was restored. But he also recommended that the gold and silver of the churches be sold in order to feed the poor. So far, so good. But his religious outlook was so thoroughly medieval and so strict that people eventually, rejected his views. They were too radical, they thought. And for example, at the carnival seasons of 1496 and 1497, masks, indecent books, and pictures were burned. They would have these big bonfires, and people of Florence had welcomed him at one point, but they believed now that he was too strict. This is where we get the term Bonafire or the Vanities, because he believed
Okay.
all these things that the Italians were holding on to, all these luxuries were vanity, and so he ordered that these things would be burned. And so there was sort of a kind of a these bonfires in the city were lighting up, and there was a lot of Lenten observances and self-flagellation and all kinds of extreme things that the Italians were taking on. Very bizarre scenes, and it almost looks like a surreal kind of thing. But his downfall was, of course, that he was attacking Pope Alexander VI. And we know from our history that, he was a Borgia Pope, and he cared more about enriching his family and his bastard children and all that, and his lifestyle was just very, very notorious. And many movies have been made about the Borgia popes, which are great to enjoy watching. There's the Borgia series, and then there's one on Netflix, and there's one on HBO, I believe.
Yeah.
So he was, Savonarola was roasting basically Alexander with his preaching, and the Florentines began to realize that all these harsh measures were creating a lot of loss of trade and commerce, and his support began to wane. And his followers began demanding miracles if he's really a prophet. And when he foretold something that came true, his followers became even more enthusiastic. But when he failed to produce even one miracle, they turned against him. So the people were very fickle, and the Pope demanded that he be excommunicated and demanded that he be punished. So a mob invaded St. Mark's and took him captive. He didn't want to defend himself, nor let his friends take up arms against him. He was tied, beaten, turned over to the authorities, tortured for several days. They came up with some charges of heresy. He wouldn't recant, and eventually he was martyred in 1498. Again, there's some great films on the martyrdom of Savonarola, but one with Alexander VI there present, and but we're not sure about that, whether that was really historical or not. But as you see, there were some people who have called for his canonization as a saint. So in the midst of all this papal turmoil, there's also a spiritual thing happening in society. We've got mystics like Meister Eckhart. I don't know why they call him Meister. Why don't I just call him Mister? Because that's what the word Meister means. But he was a Neoplatonist. His goal was to contemplate the divine, and that the divine was present throughout nature and throughout the world. God cannot be known by rational argument, but by mystical contemplation. And that's the true path to God. He wrote, within that true essence of the Godhead, which is beyond all being and every distinction, there I already existed, there I willed myself, there I knew myself, there I wished to create the man I am. For that reason, I am my own cause, according to my being, which is eternal, although not according to my becoming, which is temporal. All that is, trying to say that the spiritual is present in the material world. And because of that, and statements like that, he was charged with heresy, pantheism, and belief. He believed in the eternality and divinity of the soul. That the soul pre-existed its conception in this world. He was convicted as a heretic. He appealed to Rome, but they denied. But he died before his case was reviewed and settled. Later on, some of his followers, like Toller and Suso, would further his teachings. For example, Toller believed that that evangelical ideas like those of Luther were good ideas later on. But he set sort of the stage for sort of some of the ideas that Luther believed in. He emphasized that religion needed to be something vital in the heart, and emphasized good works. He condemned dependence on external ceremonies, and that God can be born within through the and can be avoided. We can avoid earthly temptations by having a more personal, individual spiritual life. And what this is doing, and people like John Ricebrook and Gerhard Groot begin to start creating a spirituality of a popular movement, a mystical movement that is popular. And so the question becomes, well, why do we need the church? If I can find God on my own, what good is the sacraments and the church do to me? So a group like the Brethren of Common Life comes into existence, and it's embraced by many in Europe, and many who are not living in monastic communities. Men and women, could come together, could live, could pray, could follow Christ, and they group themselves in houses of brothers and sisters. They lived sort of essentially a monastic life without taking the permanent vows that monks would take, and they would work. Work was required by all people. They would copy books, edify books, especially in their teachings. They would work for a living in the world rather than, kind of that their own labors of subsistence for a monastic community. So they labored in the world. They shared things in common. They emphasized meditation. They emphasized Christ's life as an example, And so they were nourished by spiritual practices and not by the rites of the church. And so again, this is setting the stage for, well, why do we need the church? People like Thomas à Kempis wrote one of the most popular novels in the Middle Ages, The Imitation of Christ. And a very simple, mystical imitation of Christ is what's important. They believe that one has to set one's heart on eternal realities. One has to walk with Jesus in every aspect of life. And his ideas and the influence really found a lot of acceptance among Catholics and even Protestants. There was a great influence of this mysticism that was being found by people. And as I mentioned already, this really questioned the need for the authority of the church if one can do this on one's own. There was a group of women, a lay religious community. The Pope was trying to control all these monastic movements and orders. And so these lay women founded their own religious houses of spirituality and meditation. At one point, there was over 10,000 women in that movement within 2 generations. And even after 1230, the movement even grew larger. So we are going to end it here because we're going to move into volume 2 next week of the story of Christianity. And so we're going to start moving closer to thoughts on ideas on Germany and what's going on with Luther and all that kind of stuff next week. So any questions about what we've covered today?
I have an answer as to why he's called Meister. Because Mister is actually Herr in German. I studied German for a number of years. Meister is somebody that is prominent or skilled in a certain area, like a Burgermeister is the mayor, you know, that kind of thing. So he was skilled, so they called him Meister. It was an honorary title.
I see. Good. So I'm like Meister Munoz.
There you go. But the Germans love titles. So Burgermeister is town specialist, prominent person in the town.
A master of something.
The master,
Yes.
they're skilled or they're knowledgeable on a certain area.
I see.
So they are a Meister.
Okay, I thought the word Meister was Mister.
No, that's Herr.
Herr. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mister is Herr.
Mm-hmm. Herr.
Wow. I learned something today. Great.
So where did Hildegard von Bingen fit in this? She was like, 1100s.
Yes.
Late 1100s. She was a mystic.
Yeah.
She had her own, managed to carve out her own power base.
I'm touching on her in this series. Let me see if I can find a mention of her.
I'm curious how many, there's an explosion of women joining orders. I wonder though if a lot of it also had to do with just that they have more freedom. As they don't have to marry. I'm going into the convent. So they actually, as they actually had as a woman more freedom in the convent than they did in the secular, in the outside world.
Some of them did it because they didn't want to marry the person that their father had arranged to marry them with,
Exactly.
So that as a way of being out of that.
Or they were widowed. They didn't want to be controlled by other people.
Right. So Hildegard is more around the period of Charlemagne and in 800s, 900s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And back in the days of Clooney and the foundation of these early monasteries. So several hundred years ago from where we are right now in the past.
Yeah, around 1485 was when the Tudors came to power. So this is around their time too. The War of the Roses is over.
Yeah. Right.
Hildegard died in 1179. so she was a good bit later than Charlemagne.
Yeah.
But well before this I guess the earliest underpinnings of the Reformation.
Charlemagne was crowned in 800, so a couple hundred, 200 or 300 years.
After him, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.